Good morning, friends. We're on chapter 3, Welcome Spring. Forgive my voice, I have a bit of a cold today. Summers in Rakah were my windows to reality during my years of religious school, 4 gold months back home beneath the fruit trees. The trees bore pear, pomegranate, and fig. My father planted one tree for each child, and beside them hung a canopy of fat green grapes. For 4 months I grew vegetables alongside my parents. My mother stacked the cans of seeds in our cupboards, the amount to be sowed carefully measured, so that the yield of the crop would not be too small or too large. She taught me to dig up the soil, then ease each seed inside. 4 months in the dust and haze and lays of the terrace, where my mother and sisters sewed traditional dresses, while I listened to the precise newscasters' voices as they floated from my father's beloved radio. Made in Japan, he liked to gloat. Japanese consumer goods were a rarity in Syria, since the Chinese flooded our markets with cheap junk that suited our income but insulted our tastes. 4 months of freedom and comparison, over all too soon. In the spring of 2006, Nael and I had 2 months off from school, which we were supposed to spend preparing for the final exams that would determine which university and which course of study would accept us, and so decide our entire futures. Except that it wasn't really preparation at all. By the time I moved to the empty house of my recently deceased grandfather, I was more than ready for my exam. 3 years had passed since the hysteria of the Iraq War, when Sheikh Mahmoud Kul Agassi's voice unspooled its saccharine thread from every Aleppan minibus, openly inciting the common Muslim to grab his gun, hasten toward our eastern border, and stand up to the Crusaders. These were no idle words, either. Everyone knew that he trained his followers and sent them to fight. Not content with their futile prayers, 2 of my own teachers vanished for a period, only to return slightly abashed and tell us that the buses transporting them to Iraq had been bombed en route to the border. By American air raids, they claimed. Disgusted by these noisy calls for jihad, I increasingly turned away from the religious world of school toward my own interests, soccer, English, and the reckless teen antics I had missed up to that point. Back in Raqqa, the fortified world my father had built was starting to crack. Despite his best efforts at control, he was ill-informed about the side effects of deprivation in the age of accessibility. As a teenager, I plotted my mutiny. That spring I was 17, with gelled hair and tight jeans and a counterfeit red jersey of FC Bayern Munich. I had already started to stay out late with the guys whenever I came back to Raqqa. Some nights we walked past the edges of town and set up camp on the banks of the Euphrates. We lit a fire, lit a shisha, played cards, and traded quips until the moon faded into the sky. When I stopped sometimes to sleep at my family's house, my father didn't beat me or scream. Sometimes he just shook his head with disappointment. "You are very late. Who knows where you are, where you were, or what you were doing? Look at how you're dressed, wearing red like a girl." Nail's world was as dreadful as mine. Throughout the nights of his childhood, his father would scream at his mother, and his mother, a tough, dignified woman, would hold her ground. Often his father would storm off to his second wife's house without providing any money for his first family's upkeep. At the age of 10, Niall had begun selling bread in the street to help support his family. Now he worked summers in Raqqa's grand vegetable market, loading 100-pound sacks of potatoes or throwing hundreds of watermelons onto the backs of trucks about to embark for Iraq. He started each summer light-skinned and ended up dark. Nael grew up resentful, a fellow mutineer. How had our fathers expected us to be contained? I unlocked the door to my late grandfather's house. Nael slouched in the doorframe. Nael the tall, wearing one of his ludicrously pink shirts. "How are you?" "Ya Belem," he said, laughing. I grinned. He grinned harder. Exam preparation. We had other things to learn. That spring, with Nael's help, I became a regular smoker. We never had enough money for cigarettes, but this problem unraveled in the face of Nael's ingenuity. The father of a friend of Nael's worked in an office that had a color printer, and it also had the thin paper whose texture vaguely resembled that of Syrian banknotes. The office was habitually unoccupied in early afternoon, when the heat was at its peak, and when the friend's father liked to nap. So Nael and his friend would slip inside. There the counterfeiting business would begin. One 200-pound note bought 7 packs of red or yellow galoises, enough to supply us for 3 days. Our notes were poor copies, thus easy to expose, and the act of counterfeiting, I suppose, a grave crime, so we did our shopping late in the evening. Our guidelines were these: Never go to the same place twice, never go in if there's already a customer inside. We targeted elderly shopkeepers and poor people who, to evade licensing requirements and taxes, converted rooms of their homes into shops. The small windows through which they did business were perfect through their poverty, though their poverty gave the exchange a sinister cast. Once Nail told me that in the Sareko neighborhood, he had passed off 500 fake Syrian pounds to the wife of one of his counterfeiter friend's relatives, whom he didn't know. Her husband innocently complained about the fake money to Nael's friend, who had a spasm of conscience. Nael and his friend had to compensate the poor man without him finding out. For a while business was good, but every industry collapses at some point. The scheme was interrupted by the limited quantity of paper in the office. Its supplies didn't meet the demands of our addiction. That spring we passed endless hours in talk. Nael had a flair for words. He tried to converse with everyone. He talked politics and religion with my father, sports with his brother Tarek, and art, football, and ephemera with me. Everyone liked him, and he knew how to deploy his charm perfectly whenever he wanted. He was skilled at talking to girls. He was also the man of his family, buying vegetables for his mother and teaching his little sisters about music and art. Recently, Nael had decided that he wanted to be an artist and attend art school. He got along well with my uncle. Excuse me. A fastidious, intimidating man with a passion for art who taught Nael the basics of pencil sketching. Mostly we spent our time talking about our ambitions and aspirations. Nael told me that he wanted to live a beautiful life, creating beautiful, immortal pieces of art. He showed me his sketchbooks, girls' faces, abstract angles, a horse's head and neck in profile, the tendons taut and veins pronounced. He talked about Renaissance Florence. He dropped Picasso's name. I told him I wanted to master English, but our world didn't welcome our dreams. We were both idealists. We wanted a modern country of clean buildings and respectful, educated people in neat clothing who never raised their voices, who were sensitive to others, who bothered to sweep the streets outside their homes. We looked at Raqqa and saw a society sunk deeply into its own ignorance and tastelessness. Nael loathed our people's superstitions. He hated the money they wasted on frauds who promised to heal sick kids with talismans, the way our community glorified passivity and naivety. They lacked all desire to change. What did they care about the quality of life, superficial or deep? They couldn't even water the trees on the traffic median. They wouldn't even fill potholes. They wouldn't even paint a wall. Most of all, he hated Raqqa's conservatism, which fought any evolution in technology, literature, women's education, or role in society. He protested with taboo jokes about God, Muhammad, and sex. Raqqa would never accept his art, Nael knew. The typical Raqqa thought of art as a useless pursuit that involved naked girls and blasphemous images, and still, after all that, made no money. But with that being the worst sin of all, when our week-long exams finally arrived, I realized how much my spring with Nael had taken its toll. I barely harvested sufficient marks. The 171 points I received were just enough to secure a seat in the University of Aleppo's English Literature Department. That July was a life-changer. I turned 90 degrees from south to west. I had one of the few internet connections in our neighborhood, so on the day the exam results came in, Nael stopped by my place to check his marks. He was achingly nervous. The year before, too busy with work to study, he had failed his exams, and if he failed this time, he wouldn't be allowed to take them again. Without exams, no university. Without university, no way out of Raqqa. My dial-up connection sucked. As the page loaded, bite by crawling bite, I did my best to appease him. You're going to pass. Lots of people in your field supervised you. You work hard. You really wanted this. But he paced back and forth, hands shoved in his pockets, unable to force out more than a few muttered words. His sallow face reddened fast in situations like this, and his devils danced roughly on his shoulders. I smiled reassuringly, but secretly I doubted my friend. He had taken up art awfully late. The page finally loaded, and so we learned that he had been accepted to the Damascus College of Fine Arts. He screamed. He hugged me. We burst out cursing, laughing, just about crying in chaotic teenage glee. Nael moved to the capital, Damascus, which Syrians called Sham, and I to Aleppo, Damascus's lovely rival. And from these twin points we set out on the separate courses of our lives. My Aleppo world consisted of English literature, soccer games, and long hours in a sewing workshop. Nael plunged into his new city. He drank it up greedily as if it were champagne or love itself. In Damascus, Nael found a freedom that seemed boundless compared to life with his family in Raqqa. He now drew half-nude girls, drank alcohol, and smoked hash, big sins, with an untroubled conscience. In Damascus, he lived his life free of surveillance and threw himself into his work. I don't know how many pages he filled with his hard-angled, abstract art, the overlapping lines that could have been blueprints for engines, but even when we texted, I could see that he had been transformed. He had a new self-confidence, maturity, and sense of purpose, and the requisite arrogance of an art student picked up from his new friends. He adopted their habits, bohemian clothes, late mornings with coffee, and Faroux songs. They admired themselves, convinced that the artist was humanity perfected, and looked down on everyone else. For Syrian artists, it seems it was chic to be self-righteous. By the time I finally visited Nael in Damascus, I had not seen him for 9 months. We met at the home of an acquaintance of his in Al-Muajrin, one of the few clean neighborhoods in the capital. It was a modern, middle-class apartment filled with hipsters laboriously smoking hand-rolled cigarettes, filled with Alhambra tobacco, a sub-mediocre brand that couldn't stay lit between one puff and the next, but which had somehow become de rigueur for Damascene artists. Nael lounged on the sofa. Oh, Nael, I thought, remember when we used to sit on the floor in Raqqa? He had shaved his beard into a little goatee and pulled his long hair into a ponytail. They'd call him a faggot for sure when he visited home, and wore a gray shirt flecked with white. I wouldn't even have known where to buy a shirt like that. When he greeted me, he stretched out his vowels pompously in the Damascus way. What is with this Shami accent, O Nael? I felt the distance when we greeted each other. He was different now, polite but colder, as if to show that these art guys were his brothers now and I was merely a visitor from a past life. After our few words of awkward greeting, the group returned to their conversation about some artist I had never heard of, while I sat bewildered. What had happened to Nael? I didn't yet realize his problem was not with me, but with what he'd left behind. The next morning, we went out to breakfast with a group of Nael's university friends. The restaurant was an average Damascus place, I now realize, but I had never been to a restaurant before, so it seemed like a palace of intimidating luxury, made worse by the ease with which Nael blended in. The waiters, the etiquette, the menu all baffled me, and the bill I had to at least offer to pay, and what if Nael and his friends accepted? That would be 3 days' wages gone. I was so uncomfortable that I barely ate. After our meal, we walked through old Damascus. I joked with Nael about the spring we had spent getting ready for exams. Remember how mad my dad got when we hung up a German flag on the balcony? Remember how we forged 200-pound notes? But he looked at me without interest, and all the beauty of Al-Hamidiyah Souk could not bring me 1 millimeter closer to my friend. We saw each other occasionally during our visits home to Raqqa, but it wasn't the same. Sometimes he brought his crew of Damascus guys, total phonies, I now knew, pretentious kids who racked up debts to each other after they blew their allowances posturing at cafes. And would you believe it? My friends from home all lined up to kiss their asses. Where shall we walk? What shall we do? Do you like this or that? You great guests from the capital, oh, welcome, great ones, to our humble town. We took them camping at Assad Lake. They cracked bad jokes, and when I heard my friend's phony laughter, I could hardly enjoy the water or the moon. As for the more scandalous parts of Nael's Damascus life, he tried to keep his unseemly unconventionality from reaching his people's ears. But boys have a weak point called pride, from which even the most damning secrets will leak. When we were alone, he showed me snapshots of his new life, friends, parties, and taboo sketches. I pestered him to send me copies of his electronic art collection. Hundreds of great paintings he stored on his hard drive, naked harems and funny oriental sultans. Excuse me. A captivating tableau of Jerusalem. Some Picassos, Michelangelos, and countless others whose names I have forgotten. He even showed me a wall covered with hand-sculpted plaster pussies. When we played cards, he needled me about his perfect life in the capital. Damascus was so much classier than Aleppo, he liked to say. Its university was better, of course, full of the right people, and the girls. In Damascus, Nael was drowning in them. On and on he went. I was with this girl, Then we went to visit this girl, but I needed to be home because another girl was coming to visit me. Not that I even care. Oh, did I mention this other girl? Me and her are working together on an assignment for a sculpture class. What are we sculpting? A topless model, of course. A topless girl model. You know we draw topless girls in sham. He drew the vowel out using his fake Damascus accent as if to indicate, with each silent Q and Frenchified J, that he was now civilized. Unlike us. He abandoned Raka's guttural Amaya, our commoner's tongue, as he did all other symbols of the place he had been born. How is sham? I snapped at him during one card game. Is everything just so much better in sham? He turned red but stayed silent. In our war for supremacy, Western culture was my weapon. They all might have known about 15th century Florence, but I knew the Hollywood stars. Though he spoke no English, he read Greek myths and Shakespearean plays in translation just to get one over on me. We fought our battles while hunched over card tables and video game controllers, marking victories in debates about the Odyssey, the Iliad, and the Orestia, while the rest of our friends rolled their eyes in boredom. In my second year of university, I was translating Waiting for Godot. Now I wanted Nael to perform as Vladimir. I could just see it. You could have made my room a stage, painted a tree upon the wall. Instead, Nael was already acting in a half-professional way. One summer, when college was closed, he traveled to Palmyra to perform as an extra in a TV series about the Arabian legend, poet, and lover Antara ibn Shaddad. He was a horseman. I traveled there with him and watched from beneath a palm tree in the desert's heat as he in that funny warrior outfit drew his sword just a few miles from Palmyra, the heart of ancient Queen Zenobia's Syrian kingdom, the pearl of the desert they call it. And it had for nearly 2 millennia symbolized Syrian independence and pride. Syria, the country that in a few years would be a war-torn scrap of land from which its children would march in defeat and humiliation to beg at the gates of Rome, not because Zenobia had surrendered to the mighty Caesar, but because someone had killed her and exiled them. Her vanity would be broken twice. Her capital would be vandalized again, and her gods' temples would be wrecked for the pleasure of another. The sun beat down upon our heads. I watched as Nael and the others mounted their horses. They charged their swords aloft, their silly linen costumes now so beautiful on camera. Nael's face lit up with such anarchic joy that he might as well have been riding into paradise. Have a good day, friends.